Okay, we're here with opposite numbers. You ready, Luke?
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to talk first about opposite numbers on the number line because that's a great way to see the opposites. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about a definition here. So let's read this. The opposite of a number is the number that is the same distance from 0 on the other side of 0. Okay, so that might be a little confusing. So let's go ahead and look at a number line here. So what's this point that I've graphed here on the number line?
3.
Yep.
Positive 3.
Yep, positive 3. Okay, so now let's think about what the opposite of positive 3 would be. It's the number that is the same distance from 0 on the other side of 0. So it's going to have to be somewhere over here. What would that be?
Negative 3.
That's right. So we'll go ahead and graph that. So the opposite of 3 is negative 3. Okay, now let's do another example. Here I've graphed what number?
Negative 5.
Okay, what would the opposite of negative 5 be?
Positive 5.
Positive 5, right? So that it seems like this is pretty easy, right?
Yeah.
Let's try one that's a little bit tricky. Probably not too tricky, but let's see what you think. What's the opposite of that number?
0?
That's right. The opposite of 0 is 0. So 0 is its own opposite because there's no number on the other side of 0 because there's no other side of 0. It's just 0, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Now, let's go ahead and look at what negative numbers mean as when we're thinking about the idea of the opposite. So first, before I do the next step, if I just have a number, let's say like 3 or something, and I just put parentheses around it, that's still 3, right? It's just the same number with parentheses around it?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I'm going to do that, but I'm also going to do something else here. So I have negative around this parentheses of 3. And what I'm going to try to tell you is that that's equal to negative 3. Okay, that might seem to make sense, but let's really look at what this is saying right here, okay? This whole equation or math statement. And what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to start using negative to mean the opposite. Okay, so let's break this down. So we see negative here means the opposite of 3, and then equals means is, negative 3. So the opposite of 3 is negative 3. And that's exactly what we said over here. It's just that we're doing it with a math statement instead. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, good. So let's go ahead and do another statement and see what it means. Okay? So what does that first negative mean in the same language that we did up here?
The opposite.
Okay, good. So the opposite, and now instead of saying of 3, we're going to say of what?
Negative 12.
Good. The opposite of negative 12 is what?
Positive 12.
Is positive 12, or just 12, right? And that's kind of like what we said over here, except we were using 5 over here. The opposite of negative 5 is 5. So what's really interesting here is that we have a negative right here and another negative, and it makes a positive. Interesting, huh? Okay, so let's do another one. The opposite of 72 is... Now that's going to be a little confusing. So let's try to, instead of doing this in words, let's make it easier by doing it in a math statement. So what would be the first thing we would write?
Negative?
Good. So, let's first figure out what the opposite of 72 is. What was the opposite of 72?
Negative 72.
Good. And then we'll do this part over here. So the opposite of that would be kind of like this, right? A negative with the parentheses around, just like we did with the negative 12 up here. So then we have the opposite of 72. What's that going to equal then?
72.
Right. So now we can complete that statement. So here's a situation where we had words that were kind of confusing, but when we wrote it in a math statement, then it became simpler, easier to see, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's see if we can come up with a rule for what we've just defined here. So the rule that I have written here is the opposite of a number is that number. So that sounds kind of confusing to me too, but let's just go ahead and read through this. Like the opposite of 72 is 72.
Yeah.
Kind of makes sense? But this is a long way to write this out. So let's write it out in math language instead. The negative of a negative is positive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, good. So now let's do an example and see if we can solve a little puzzle here. So here's an example. Which of the following is true? So we're going to see which of these things over here is equal to 37. Okay?
Okay.
How about this first one?
No.
Okay, you're right, because that's negative 37. It's the opposite of 37. So nope, that one's not true. What about this one right here?
That looks true.
That is true, because it's the opposite of 37, so it's 37, right?
Yeah.
And the other way to think about it is that a negative times a negative, or the negative of a negative, is positive. So yep, this one works. Okay, how about this one right here?
That one's just negative 37.
You're right. So is that one true?
No.
Good. How about this one here?
That one is true.
That one's true, because the parentheses don't change the value, right? So we'll go ahead and circle that. And then what about this one over here?
No.
Right. You're right. So here we've learned a lot about opposite numbers, and the really cool thing that you've learned is right here. The negative of a negative is positive, and as you go further and further in math, that one's going to be really useful for you. Sound good?
Yeah.